This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to You're Dead to Me, a history podcast for people who don't like history, or at least people who forgot to learn any at school. My name is Greg Jenner. I'm a public historian, author, and I'm the chief nerd on the BBC comedy show Horrible Histories. When I whip up a podcast, it's basically one part funny, two parts fact. Stick it in the cauldron, add eye of newt. Lovely. In case you've not heard You're Dead to Me before, every episode I'm joined by an expert historian who is top of the class, and a comedian who's a class act. And today we are donning our pointy hats, buying a black cat, and going for a magical broomstick ride back to early modern Europe to explore all things witchy. Or rather, all things European witch craze. Joining me in History Corner, she is a superstar historian and broadcaster, professor at the University of Roehampton, author of loads of books, including, handily, Witchcraft, a Ladybird expert book. You'll have seen her on the telly, on all the channels, and including Insert Name Here, which is a very funny comedy show with historians on it, which is great. It is, of course, Professor Susanna Lipscomb. Hi, Susanna, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for coming in. You are a witch expert, but...
Burn her! Burn her! Sorry.
But that's one of the things you do.
It is. I also know a bit about Henry VIII.
All right.
And, occasional things about other things. But today, it's all witches.
All witches, all of the time. And in Comedy Corner, she is a comedy renaissance woman, a comedian, a writer, an actor, an improv wizard. You'll have seen her on QI, Have Got News for You, Murder and Successful, Peep Show, and she is the host of the award-winning and surprisingly funny podcast about death, Griefcast. It's Carrie-Ad Lloyd. Hello.
Hello.
Do you love witches?
I effing love witches.
Oh.
I'm a big witch fan.
That was nearly an F-bomb, but not
I know,
quite. Well
I know.
done.
I managed to maintain.
You're a
hold
pod
myself
pro.
back. I wanted to be a witch when I was a teenager,
Really?
and I did that teenage girl thing of thinking, maybe I am. Maybe I am if I do this spell. Maybe I. There's a lot of girls out there who think, like some girls want to be princesses, some girls want to be witches.
You went sort of goth, did you?
I was a goth, yes. I was a
Okay.
goth. I watched a little bit too much of The Craft. Do you remember
yeah.
The Craft?
Yeah.
Light as a feather, stiff as a board. And I thought, yep, I can do this. And I also loved Witches, the Roald Dahl book as well.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I loved The
Yes.
Worst Witch. I was into Meghan Mogg, guys. I started early with witches. Big witch fan.
Early stuff, the early albums before it got mainstream.
Before it got too mainstream, everyone was doing it.
Susie, who's your witch icon growing up, pop
It
culture?
is Roald Dahl's Grand High Witch.
yes,
She
amazing.
was absolutely terrifying.
So terrifying.
Angelica Houston really brought her to life in the film, didn't she, as well? But even just reading the book, that she had that bald head, do you remember?
Yeah.
And the feet without toes.
Yeah, and the
children-
shoes they rubbed in.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. And they thought children smelled like dog's droppings. And,
Yeah.
she was just, it's so evocative, and you really thought you could walk down the street and any woman might be a witch.
Yeah, because it was good because you'd grown up with just black hats and cats and broomsticks, and when you read the Roald Dahl, you were like, it could be anyone. Like, it's not that she won't signify to you that she's a witch. She will look like a normal person.
All right, well, this is the bit where we talk about the pop culture legacies. So this is called the So What Do You Know? Where I list all the things that people at home probably know about the subject. So, what do you know? As a kid, people might have grown up on Meghan Mogg, Mildred Hubble, Hermione Granger, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Terry Pratchett's Granny Weatherwax. Then you've got your Macbeth, Weird Sisters, your Game of Thrones, Melisandre, who's popping out a sort of murderous cave baby made of smoke. Weird. Then historically, we've got the witch craze. Everyone probably has heard of the Salem witch trials. There's Good Omens. Then you've got Little Mix, Black Magic. Hot banger, one of my favourites. We always have to mention Little Mix. It's a running gag on this show.
Stevie Nicks, surely? Modern Witch?
Yeah, absolutely. So witchcraft is really potent in pop culture. It's all around us. It's very, very dominant. It's something that we find both alluring and glamorous and also creepy and horrific. But where does it come from? Why are we so obsessed with it? Let's find out. That's what the podcast is for. Where do we start with witchcraft? Because, we're talking about the European witch craze. That is when?
So we're taking us back to between about 1450 and 1750. But if we're really zeroing in, it would be 1560 to about 1650. So about a century across Europe. And it's a period in which witches are perceived to be especially dangerous. And so as a result of that, they are persecuted and prosecuted and then executed in large numbers.
All the fun of the fair. But there'd been witches before that. obviously not real witches, but there'd been
Whoa,
people.
whoa, whoa!
Well, okay, maybe there
Come
are people who
on,
thought
don't be-
themselves as
yeah,
witches.
don't slander. They'll get you, Greg.
Yeah, there's a quick. I mean, that's the really fascinating thing about this is to what extent we are talking about something that is in reality, or these people are alleged witches. And we know there are alleged witches back as far back as ancient Greece. So there's the earliest case I found is from 330 BC. You can see witchcraft beliefs throughout history.
Okay.
So it's not something that arose at that period of time, but it is in that period of time that people get particularly concerned about there being witches.
Why do people suddenly get concerned? We were talking nearly 600 years ago. There's that sort of key century you've mentioned, 1560 to 1660. Why is it this particular moment that suddenly people really
Well,
start?
that's the big question. I mean,
Is it like the Beatles? It's just like right time, right place.
Great haircuts.
Yeah, like good. Like everyone's like, yeah, you know what? We're all into this, and then it just like caught fire. Sorry.
Well, there's a whole. I mean, there's so many arguments about what it could be. Socioeconomic context, whether you're thinking about ideas about women. One particular explanation is that this is the time of the Reformation, so it's a time when people are particularly concerned about living in the end days, and this kind of sense of apocalyptic angst means that they see the devil everywhere. So he's at the forefront of their minds as never before. And
So the Reformation would be a sort of a religious conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism,
Yes,
and various sects in that.
The rise of Protestantism as a kind of schism in the church between Catholics and Protestants. It's not as simple as Catholics calling Protestants witches and Protestants calling Catholics witches. That would be nice and straightforward. But people are concerned about their souls, and they're concerned about what's the right way to live and who is the opposite of that. And so witches are obviously the ultimate opposite.
Like, because the other thing I've always heard is that like some of them were just like medicinal herbal ladies, and then they just they were just like, oh, have some basil, this will help you out, and then someone was like, witch. Is that true?
Well, there's definitely something in it. I mean, what's really hard to say is that we can map all the people who were herbal healers, known as cunning men and women in England, onto people who are accused of witchcraft. But absolutely at the time, like medical knowledge for sort of ordinary people was pretty much the same as what physicians had. So they were dealing with herbs and trying to conjure up potent recipes for curing disease, and then they might throw in a prayer or a spell or two,
Try
and
it
then
all,
before
mate.
you know
Chuck
it,
it all in.
Exactly, before you know it, then that looks like it could be witchcraft or something of supernatural power.
I know it looks like witchcraft. I've got a cauldron. Yes. There's a man bleeding. Yes. But actually, I'm just a local GP. That's what's happening with these ladies. Okay.
Doing
Right.
community care.
Yeah.
Carrie Ann, have you ever heard of the Malleus Maleficarum?
No, but it sounded like you just cast a spell. I haven't heard of it. It sounded a bit like the Mabinogion as well. It threw me slightly.
No, it's not that.
I thought you were speaking
that's
Welsh.
a whole other.
Yeah.
I'd love to speak Welsh. I can't speak
Oh,
Welsh.
do even in Shadow can I?
Oh.
Neither can I. That's
Oh,
what
right.
that means.
Is that you saying I can't speak Welsh?
I can't speak Welsh.
Okay. Malleus Maleficarum is a kind of like a best-selling book.
Oh, really?
It's second only to the Bible in terms of sales.
What?
And it's sort of a self-help book, but not really self-help, is it? It's more of a
kind
kind
of manual.
It's a manual on. Do you want to explain, Susanna?
Yeah, so Malleus Maleficarum means the hammer of the witches, and it was published in the 1480s. It was written by a German Dominican monk called Heinrich Kramer, who Professor Malcolm Gaskell has described as a superstitious psychopath. And
It was the Da Vinci
argued-
Code of its day, is what I'm hearing. Yeah.
It was incredibly popular. It argued that witches existed, basically, and that they worked for the devil, and it gave you tips on how to find them and how to exterminate them.
And who was he then? Who's this bastard that just turns up and starts saying, oh, she's got a black hat, walk quicker?
He's someone who's borrowing the prestige of the church. So one of the key things that makes it important is that he reproduces a papal bull, so an order by the Pope at the beginning of the book, which says that witches are heretics. And so it looks like he's acting for the church, that he's their official spokesman, but in fact he's someone who's jumped up and done exactly what you said and puts himself in this role as an authority figure.
Surprise, surprise, guys. That's happened quite a lot in history,
Absolutely,
doesn't
it does. But also, I mean, it comes out in 1487. Printing's been around for like 30 years.
What's it called? Malleus Maleficarum.
That's it.
Do you have to say it like that?
Malleus
Malleus?
Maleficarum.
Malleus Maleficarum. Yeah,
Very
okay.
nice.
Thanks.
Hammer of the Witches. Good name for a heavy metal band.
Yeah,
Anyone
yeah.
fancy starting one? So it's hugely significant. Has a massive knock-on effect. Germany is sort of it's kind of one of the hubs, isn't it, where the witch craze kind of has a lot of heat, if you pardon the pun, and it sort of radiates out. Our researcher on this episode, Esther, is Hungarian. She told us that vampire folklore is also connected to witches as well in Transylvania.
And what's really interesting about something like this being put in print is that it means that you've got people who are of elite status who are reading this, and that facilitates a really crucial shift that makes the witch craze possible, in that once elites start to believe it, it starts to move into law. And so you start to have witchcraft becoming a crime, like black magic becoming a capital offence. And that's the thing that makes it possible to prosecute witches, literally at trial, and therefore to execute them.
So before it wasn't illegal, they were just like, oh, there are witches, but what do? They're just out there.
That's right. So it became illegal in England in 1542, Scotland in 1563, and sort of across Europe at various times in the 16th century.
So literally the government at the time believed that so much, they were like, well, we better enshrine this into law.
Isn't that amazing?
To stop these women. That's like, do you remember Lembit Opik was like in charge of like aliens? Like, do you remember when he was like given this? Sorry, a bit of a leap. But I remember reading like he was in charge of alien invasion, and like if that happened, Lembit was the man who'd like looked into it. And you're like, why is any money funding that? Like, why was any money funding?
And also Lembit Opik.
And also
that is not the guy you want.
I mean, there's a whole podcast to start on that. But like, so they literally, I can't imagine. Like all these guys just sat around and were like, "Have you heard? Apparently they're real. We better get the law on these women."
Well, I think it comes down to a lot of it is women, a lot of it's female power, and so you've got a law here saying women, witches can do things with this power of theirs. They can kill, they can harm.
Were women at this point becoming more? Was there some way that women were becoming more powerful that made that patriarchal society panic?
It certainly. Well, she should be a historian. This is brilliant. This is certainly a period in which the patriarchy is becoming very anxious.
Yeah,
yes,
but
definitely.
what were women doing? Like, it's not like after the war where you're like, oh, they've all got jobs.
And this is an era where we suddenly get women on the throne. I mean, you get Mary Tudor, the first English queen, then Elizabeth. You've got Jane Grey for 9 days. I mean, that's not really, she doesn't stay for long. In Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots.
Yep.
In France, of course, there have been a couple of queens who are sort of ruling on behalf of sons and so on. Suddenly, women are asserting power.
That's so interesting. I've never probably thought of that, because Elizabeth does her own marketing campaign so well, but of course the repercussions of that must be that men sort of like, we better not let that happen again, guys. Like, one got through, but like let's keep an eye on that. Yeah, that's so interesting.
But I'm now going to subvert you, because Cariad.
Yes.
Can you guess?
Malleus Maleficarum.
Malleus Maleficarum. Can you guess what percentage of witches were men in Iceland?
Ooh, Iceland.
And I don't mean the shop.
No, but Iceland, as we know, is very gender equal.
Yes.
They're really big on that, and their gender pay gap is one of the smallest in the world. So I'm saying 50%.
They are very progressive. They were considerably more woke than that. 92% of witches were men.
Wow.
So this is a sort of an interesting construct for us, because
did they just not have the word wizard?
Witches and wizards are different, so this is
okay.
a thing that we need to kind of get our head around a little bit. I mean, it's fair to say, certainly in England and Scotland, most of the cases are women, but not all of them, isn't it, Susanna?
Yeah, something like 90%. So there are two periods in British history where in the 1590s in Scotland and in the 1640s in East Anglia and Essex, where there are particularly large numbers of witches tried and executed, and the figures are high in terms of women, so 90% in Essex, for example. But across Europe, there are various places. Russia's another place where there's a lot of male witches. Normandy, lots of male witches. And so witches here, and New England male witches.
It's a joy, as a woman who's always described as a female comedian, to hear the phrase male witch. You're like, yeah, how does it feel to be a male witch? They're like, I'm just a witch. I'm just the same as the women. Why do I have to be a male witch?
Let's move on to some of the techniques for hunting a witch. This is not an advice. Don't use this. Cariad, have you ever heard of the Diabolic Pact?
I think it's called Brexit these days.
Yes, that's certainly one of them.
Yeah.
No, in the context of the 16th, 17th century, the Diabolic Pact. All right, well, Susanna, can we hear a bit more about what this was?
So this is a pact with the devil, basically. So it's not just herbs, it's that you have been beguiled by Satan's promises of wealth or power or whatever it is, and have chosen to renounce your baptism and offer the devil your soul, and in return you'll be able to do all sorts of things. And It was sealed, it was thought, in the demonologies, they write about this a lot, by nocturnal sabbats. So at night, witches would get together and they would demonstrate their obedience to the devil by kissing his anus. So this was the kiss of shame.
Yeah,
it was called.
osculum infame in Latin, isn't
thank
it?
you.
Yeah,
for that.
only
Yeah.
some men would think that's what women get up to. No, do you know what? No, thank you. We don't want to do that. You imagine in your heads, yeah, I bet they'd like to kiss some bums, wouldn't they? That's what all those women are doing. No, do you know what? They're not. They don't want to do that.
There's also a heretical sect called the Cathars, and they're supposed to kiss the anus of a cat. So just so you know.
Disgusting behaviour.
And they were also supposed to have sex with him, and his incubi and succubi, his semen was apparently intolerably cold.
What a relief, my vagina is so hot. That devil has cooled me right down. Thank you. Wonderful.
And he appeared perhaps in the form of a goat or a toad or
Yeah, I read that they would say, I read old witch trials and they would say, you know, she saw him in the form of a bird and it was the devil, and they would say like, I saw her talking to the bird. You're like some poor woman just chatting to a blackbird, and suddenly it's like she was talking to the devil. Yeah.
And that's also the idea of witches' familiars, isn't it? The idea of them
yeah,
having like a
yeah.
black cat or some animal.
which is a particularly English idea. We don't really see it
Oh,
much
is
in
it?
Europe actually.
We're
But
the only ones obsessed with black cats. That's so lame, isn't it? We're like, yeah, throw the cat in. It was probably something to do with that. The rest
But
of
Hollywood's
Europe.
picked it up, so I guess it's gone
Yeah.
global now through Hollywood culture.
well, because the culture of witchcraft in England spread to New England, so therefore the
Sure.
American version of witchcraft is the English one, really. But also they were thought to do, pretty horrid things like take their newborns and sacrifice them to the devil, and cannibalism, infanticide, but also particularly raising storms, killing crops. So it's a anti-fertility as well, is what they're getting up to.
Nasty stuff. It's not just a fear of the devil in the world, but a knowledge that he's in the world. So there's the idea that the devil definitely exists, he's definitely in the world, and these women are in league with him. But they're not demons themselves, are they? They're ordinary people. But why is it that women are susceptible rather than men?
We
in
love
theory?
cold semen.
Sure, who among us doesn't?
Yeah, but women are very susceptible to it.
But that's basically it. I mean, that's it in a nutshell, really. That there's a sense that women were considered at the time to be completely insatiable. It's really interesting in terms of cultural attitudes. Women are thought to want sex all the time.
How
and
weird at that
so,
time. And then it moves on to like they don't want it at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've
but
got a headache,
Probably
yeah.
don't give it to her.
But so it's this idea that women are much more susceptible to sexual sin, and therefore the devil can tempt them more easily.
Which goes back to Eve and the apple
Exactly.
in the Garden of Eden. So women are horny for horns, lusty for Lucifer. So there are male witches, but women are the ones who have less willpower.
Exactly.
So it's like they're weaker, they're vulnerable.
Yeah.
And that means the devil can come along in the form of a cat's anus, whisper some sweet words to them, and before they know it, they've killed a baby.
Imagine if he turned up just as a giant cat's anus. That's all he was. Not legs, not head, just
Where
an
is the
anus.
rest of the cat?
A
Oh, Diablo.
6-foot anus.
No, it's just
Amazing.
the anus. It just works really well.
Another good name for a band, 6-foot anus. So we see the witch craze take off in England and Scotland, Wales and Ireland. Scotland's a separate country at this point. But why is there a difference? One of the reasons that some historians have given is the Little Ice Age, which sounds like a sort of DreamWorks animation for kids, but it's the opposite of global warming. Have you ever heard of this, Cariad?
No.
It's the idea that there's sort of a drop in temperature across
There's a really
the world.
significant drop in temperature from about 1560.
Hey.
Coincidence. So temperatures drop. So by the time we get to 1607, there's the first frost fair on the Thames. So the ice is thick enough for
is that
people
why?
to
'Cause I've always
have frost.
thought, what happened to the frost fairs? They'd be like, they can skate on Thames. I was like, well, how come we can't do that now? Like,
There's two reasons for that. The global warming, obviously, and the
Yeah.
other reason is the embankment changed the flow of the river.
yes.
So by building an embankment, you change the dynamics of water.
In the 1680s, they could roast oxes on the Thames in winter.
Whoa.
You
That's
can have
how.
fire on ice.
So fire on ice, yes.
Game of Thrones.
Very, yes,
Game
very
of
good.
Thrones. Excellent
That's
Game of Thrones
another
reference.
Game of
So,
Thrones reference. Sorry.
Yeah, so terror, and also just throw in the fact at the time you've got like 1 in 4 harvests are failing, and it's not like people can pop to the supermarket. You've got,
Yeah.
your harvest fails, people are hungry. If 2 harvests fail in a row, there's famine. And in the 1590s, there's a terrible period where it rains pretty much for 4 years, and so
What?
crops are destroyed. Yeah, across Europe incessantly, and so crops are destroyed. And so there's a very much, and sort of these conditions are, and then add in plague recurring every 16 years, warfare,
Sure.
religious
Throw a
division.
little sprinkle of that
just,
in.
Yeah, and you've got a situation where you feel like somebody's got to be to blame for these
That
conditions.
is so fascinating because it does sound like now of like things that are out of people's control when Can I swear? I keep wanting to swear.
Yeah, go on.
When shit hits the fan.
Yeah.
Like, that's what's happening now. When things are far away, people can get on with their own lives. And at the moment, you can see it's creeping into people's, literally their street. So they start panicking and they start looking to blame. And you see all these other societal problems. So you can see at the moment, they're like, well, harvest is fails. It keeps raining. Also, Laura down the road is a little bit strange. And actually, since she moved to the village, the crops failed. Like, you're just looking for something because there's no logic. And they didn't even have scientists not to listen to, unlike us who have them and we don't listen to them.
They had John Dee. He was a wizard.
They had a wizard. Of course.
He was the astronomer royal / astrologer royal for Elizabeth I.
Saucy boy.
So he did a lot of saucy stuff.
I know about John
wife
Dee.
swapping.
He was saucy. So they were just looking for something to make sense.
It's spot on, because the people are hungry and then they're angry and then they're envious of those who've got more than them, and it creates a sort of the mental space in which the accusations can occur. And there's a really great historian called Robin Briggs who wrote particularly about this, the fact that it really comes down to these neighbourly relations, and you've got to look at the interactions of people with each other, because up until then, quite a lot of the time, people have been doing these grand theories of it. Because it is the Reformation, it must be this and that, and actually, it really does come down to these everyday interactions.
Yeah. What this might be jumping ahead? Did it just sort of stop? Did people just go, oh, God, sorry about that. It's embarrassing. I just burnt someone yesterday. What was I thinking? Did everyone sort of wake up from a hangover? Like, oh, my God, we burnt 5 of them. What were we? Oh, that's so embarrassing.
Writing an apology note.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry about the burning.
We thought she'd slept with the devil. Like, I'm so sorry.
It is basically a sort of change of, there's a change of mentality. There's a different attitude that arises towards the use of evidence, for example. I mean, one of the interesting things is at this time, this is being prosecuted under law, and so you've got to prove it. And generally speaking, if you want to prove a crime against somebody in Europe, you have to have 2 witnesses. But the thing about witchcraft is there doesn't tend to be witnesses because, of course, the devil's sneaky like that and he hides all the evidence. Yep. So then you have to find a way to get the evidence. So then you need a confession. And so then it's whether you believe confessions, particularly if they're extracted under torture or not. And it's changing attitudes towards the law, amongst other things.
Wow.
Susanna, who's the first person to be executed for witchcraft in England?
It's a woman called Agnes Waterhouse in 1566. So she was executed after having been accused by her sister, Elizabeth Frances, who was also found guilty. But
so family turning on family.
Wow. It's pure Jeremy Kyle, isn't it? That's pure like today on Jeremy Kyle.
And now they've stopped that, so who knows what to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So there's a thing called swimming, which was not popping down to your local Lido for a splash. It was dunking, but it's this sort of logical puzzle where they are looking to prove evil or innocence using water.
And again, it's a British tradition, particularly. It's something that James
we're so
the
bad at
Sixth
inventing
first comes up with.
torture. We're awful at it. I mean, we're brilliant at it, but awful.
So they so actually it's not the dunking chair. We often think of the ducking chair. That's actually for also women, but the scolds, the women who are speaking out of turn.
Oh God, I would have got that.
We all would have got
you
that.
You and your opinions,
we all would have got that. But swimming is when is it called an ordeal, as you say, for testing for witchcraft, and the alleged witch is stripped naked. Her thumbs or his thumbs are tied to his toes, and then they're dipped into a river. And if they're innocent, they're thought to sink, and then hopefully be pulled out in time by ropes. And if they're guilty, it's thought that the waters will reject them as they have rejected their baptism, and so they will be thrust up out of the water, and they will float.
So baptism inversion, really. It's the idea that the water will say, no, you're not holy, out you get.
Exactly.
But did the water ever reject anyone? Did anyone ever literally go, wow, that water just spat that woman out?
Well, I suppose if you had a bit of gas that day, you were floating around. I don't know.
Some people are quite buoyant. I mean, the humans, we are buoyant as humans, but
that's so horrible. That's so horrible.
So the logic of it essentially was to try and prove it using nature. People presumably drowned in the process.
And so quite often, if you were innocent, then you might drown because you'd gone underwater and they didn't pull you out in time. Yeah, it's pretty horrible.
God, the logic behind that.
Very much the Monty Python logic, isn't it? In Holy Grail, it's, if she weighs the same as a duck, she's a witch.
Yeah.
So that's pretty nasty. That is in England and Scotland. There is a difference, though, between England and Scotland in terms of execution. Do you know what it is, Carrie-Anne?
No, I wonder which one is. One of us is probably more brutal. I could be either.
Depends
culture.
what you think is brutal.
Yeah,
so,
God.
You've mentioned burnings.
Yes.
Which one? do you think does the burning?
Scotland's colder. Do they go for burning? heat up a local village at the same time?
Correct answer for the probably the wrong logic,
There
but
you go,
it
there
is
you go.
Scotland. Susanna, why does Scotland burn witches and England hangs them or crushes them?
Oh, God.
So across Europe, quite a lot. In Spain, for example, they also burn them, whereas in New England, like England, they hang them. And it's basically about what you think the crime is. So if you think the crime of witchcraft is heresy, then you need to burn them. Whereas actually, if it's maleficium is the technical term, so doing harm with magic, killing someone with magic, and that's a crime under law, then you are hanged like a murderer or, like a thief at the time.
Wow. It's so weird, isn't it? Because you have to believe that magic is real
Yes.
to believe that that woman is guilty of it. And that in itself, if you believe in magic is real, surely isn't that, in a way, not a Christian act to believe that, like...
No, it's perfectly orthodox at the time. In fact,
Yeah.
there's a verse in Exodus that people cite all the time that say, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Now, critics of that challenged the translation from the Hebrew, but at the time, it was orthodox doctrine to find and search out witches.
Oh,
So
my
many-
God.
so many issues.
So many issues. Get a better translator next time, guys.
Definitely. There's a really famous case called the Pendle Hill witch trials. Ever heard of
I've
that?
heard of that,
Yeah,
yes.
it's
I
quite
have
well
heard of that,
known.
yeah.
Can you tell us about that story? Because it's a really complicated one, isn't it?
It is, and it's big in this country because of so many people involved. So it's not huge numbers by comparison to Europe or indeed to Salem, but 12 people are accused, 10 women, 2 men.
Wow.
11 of them are tried and 10 are found guilty and executed. So it's in Lancashire in 1612, and it starts with a young girl called Alison Device who said that she had harmed a peddler because she tried to buy pins off him. He wouldn't give them to her, and then he fell down and had a stroke. And she believed that she had done it because she thought she'd sold her soul to the devil. And this is a kind of family tradition because her mother also was accused of witchcraft. Her grandmother, who's known as Old Demdike, is accused of witchcraft. And she said she'd sold her soul to the devil 20 years before. So there's very much this culture of women who were probably cunning men and women, or cunning women in this case, thinking that they could do this damage to somebody.
It's a pretty complicated story. What would you sell your soul to the devil for, Cariad, in return for riches on earth?
Constant supply of green and black's chocolate.
That's quite a low sale price for your
Dude,
soul.
it's pricey. It's pricey, that green and black.
Cost of chocolate, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I'd probably go for rhythm
ability-
guitarist Metallica. That's
Oh,
That's
really?
what I'd go for.
Oh, okay. I see. I went low. Yeah. Now you've said that. Yeah. Yeah.
If I'm going to burn in eternity, then I at least want to play Glastonbury with Metallica.
I'd be full of chocolate.
All right.
I'd smell delicious.
But I mean, the Pendle Hill witch trials is a case where you see a community essentially turning on itself, and it blows up into quite a big thing. But there are case studies where it gets a bit farcical and almost falls apart. Really, there's one called the Salisbury trials, again Lancashire.
Yes, it's happening almost exactly after the Pendle witch trials.
So same year, 1612, and this one doesn't quite produce the same outcome.
No, this is an interesting one. So in the Pendle witch trials, again, we have a daughter accusing a mother. There's a 9-year-old girl called Janet Device who gives evidence against her mother and brother and sister. And as a result of this, apart from old Demdike, who dies in a cell under Lancashire Castle, the rest of them are hanged.
Wow.
And one gets off at Gallows Hill. But with the case with Salisbury, we have another young girl, a 14-year-old girl called Grace, who's accusing people of witchcraft. But it turns out that actually she has been coached. So maybe they're looking to sort of the example of Pendle, perhaps. A local Catholic priest called Thompson has forced her to incriminate her Protestant, her Anglican relatives. And what's interesting here is that the system of justice finds this out. And so the 3 accused women are set free.
Wow.
And what
that's
happened to Grace? So
amazing.
she's called Grace Sourbatts, which I think is a great name.
It's amazing.
Does
British
she
name.
get punished for lying, for perjury?
I don't know what happened to
Oh,
Grace
really?
Sourbatts, actually.
That's interesting.
Sorry, don't know.
What happened to that blooming Catholic priest that coached her to do it?
Well, it all just dissolves.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, but that's the interesting thing about it, that that's not really considered to be so much of a crime as the actual potential
I
for witchcraft,
see,
which
yeah.
is far more serious.
But in
Even though-
France, there's this story of the Loudun possessions, where there is a priest again, and he's called Urbain Grandier, isn't he? And that's a really weird story, because he gets nuns to be possessed by the devil, and then he ends up being burned, but they end up still kind of possessed.
You can't keep a good nun down.
It's a really creepy story. It's a very good movie. So they're doing like weird, sexy stuff. They're getting naked. They're screaming, and they become like a tourist attraction. People go to see the crazy nuns. One of the most famous books about witchcraft or about sort of sinister things is written by quite a famous guy. You might have heard of him, King James I.
Whoa.
King James VI of Scotland, because he's the King of Scotland first, then he becomes King of England. His book is called Demonology.
Right.
And he really believes, doesn't he, Susanna? He's really into it.
Yeah, so he has had encounters with witches himself, he thinks, in the 1590s.
Oh, sorry. That's when Macbeth gets written.
It is.
Yes, thank
That's
you.
right.
I knew something else. Yeah.
And so he writes this book, Demonology, which is the only book about the subject by a reigning monarch, and is
Until Elizabeth II gets in there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You never know. And it's about the reality of witches, but also fairies and demons and werewolves. And in fact, I'm sure that some of the people who wrote the True Blood series or whatever had read it, because there's things in it about glamouring your victims, and there's all the culture that comes out in later series. And it's written to refute scepticism. So it's an argument between two people, and he says he writes it because of the fearful abounding at this time of these detestable slaves of the devil. And so it's a bestseller, like the Malleus Maleficarum. People buy it in huge numbers, and it is really potent in terms of affecting people's ideas about things.
And the most famous associated case, probably, or person associated with witchcraft in England in the 1600s is Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General.
Yes,
Have you heard of him?
Yeah.
Another great movie.
From comedies. These often mentioned in comedies.
Yeah.
Bridget Christie did a whole show where she pretended to be Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, for a bit. And there's an Inside Number 9 as well.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, when they're talking about that, yes.
His story is a weird one because he's sort of self-appointed.
He's totally self-appointed, yeah. That's his, what title shall I have? I'll have Witchfinder General.
Literally, he says, I'm the Witchfinder General.
Yeah. And he is...
Oh, my God. Nobody says we need a witchfinder. He just appears one day. He's like, I'm the Witchfinder General, and everyone's like, oh God, it's that guy. You know,
he's not even the Witchfinder Regional. He's kind of,
assistant to the assistant regional manager.
Exactly,
yeah.
Towns in East Anglia and Essex pay him to find out if there are witches in their community and to help them deal with it. So he makes a lot of money off finding witches, and he moves around from place to place doing that in the time of the English Civil War. So the reason he can get away with it is because it's a time of anarchy, and so ordinary kind of law is broken down a bit, and he's taking advantage of that situation.
What a bastard.
And what are his techniques? As well as the swimming, ducking people, checking the water, what else is he looking for?
So he is interested in whether people have made a deal with the devil, and he tries to find out the truth of that by sleep deprivation.
Oh my
so
God.
he takes his victims, walks them up and down for 3 days, or has people do it because of course he's sleeping, for several days at a time. And so there's an 80-year-old woman, Elizabeth Clark, as the first victim, and because they believe at the time that pain is a guarantor of truth. Normally in England, torture is not used. It's not common under law. But it is used in Europe, and there you've got, the rack and strappado, which is where you're held up by your wrists behind your back, or so stretching the body or compressing the body, thumb screws, or used in Scotland, for example. But sleep deprivation is a particular English form of torture that is used for
We
witches.
like to do it slightly different here. It's more psychologically damaging and more horrific in the long term. Oh, God.
Yes, I know about it at the moment.
Yeah.
Have a 3-month-old. So and as a result of that, of course, you get lots of people who will denounce others. That's the thing
just say
about
anything.
torture.
It's just so out of it.
I'm a chronic
Right.
insomniac, and the longest I've gone without sleep is 5 days. And on day 5, I became hysterical and just giggled at everything. I found a bottle of ketchup so funny. I was just crying with laughter.
You are
So
a dream
I
Edinburgh
was-
audience,
yeah,
but
exactly. Yeah, I should have been
not
in
for
your
your mental health.
So
that's
it's
so
hugely
awful.
powerful, isn't it? Lack of sleep.
Yes.
You ever heard of witches' marks, Cariad?
Witches'
marks,
marks.
or marks of the devil?
Oh, yeah, that rings a bell. Like on them, on the
Yeah.
house. I'm really guessing there.
Both forms of
Okay,
witches' mark,
great.
actually.
Yeah.
Spot on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was another Matthew Hopkins speciality. So looking for a sign of the devil that again, if they've made a pact with the devil, he's probably put a mark on their body. And
didn't they used to blame birthmarks?
Birthmark, exactly. It's exactly moles, some sort of skin tag, and it was said to be in some secret place. Which guess what? It's not just looking under the armpits. It's going to be looking between a woman's
in your
legs.
pants, Matthew Hopkins.
Yeah.
In your
Tell
pants.
surprise.
And it was thought that the place was insensible to pain, so they would stick needles into this part to try and find out what the part was. But it's also actually, I think, really important. There's something here going on about old women and body shaming, and because quite often they're saying that this mark is a teat from which the devil can suck or whatever. So basically, if you've got any kind of protuberance on your body, or genitalia particularly, that's going to be used as an example of the devil's mark. It's really horrific.
It's absolutely horrific, and as you say, it's he's looking for any excuse. And he's using people's age against them. I think it's fair to say he was an absolute dick.
Yeah, I think so.
What a horrible man.
Oh my God. How did he get away? Why was nobody like, that guy who's got no qualifications and just like calling in the Witchfinder Jack? Why did like someone from his school turn up and be like, oh yeah, we thought he was a dick at school and we didn't listen to him and we're kind of surprised you're all listening to
Everyone's
him.
a bit preoccupied with the war. So
Fair play.
Huge numbers of people are dying in the war. And also the area it happens is really crucially an area where lots of people are Puritans, become a really sort of, godly folk. And it's from that area, actually, you have a lot of the people moving to New England to set up new communities, which is why it happens there as well.
Yeah.
That's obviously an English story, but across Europe in total, the witch craze, we tend to say 1450 to 1750, but that century of 1560 to 1660 seems to be the real zenith. How many people do we think are executed in total? Because I've seen crazy numbers like 5 million, and that seems high.
Yeah, I mean, there've been also that's Brown's Da Vinci Code. He says 5 million. I know your sources now. Actually, we think probably something like 90,000.
90,000. Okay, so Wembley
which
Stadium.
is still a huge number of people. 90,000 is sort of best guess, but it's really hard to say.
Does that surprise you, Carrie?
Yeah,
the number?
because it's just... What a bizarre... Humans are so weird, aren't they?
They are.
And also, I think the pop music, I'm joking, but it's like an interesting comparison, isn't it? Of like, when you see people going hysterical about a band or a boy band or that sort of thing, how it can be contagious. And I'm sort of glad that, like, music exists and is allowed to... people can express that further that way, because you can see how easily humans just... decide that people are other, like it's so and it can
And the power of the group, as you say,
power of the group,
you get a community who say that person's a witch, and you can do something as a group that you wouldn't do as an individual.
But I just think the power of the group is really like, it's so seductive. It's so seductive, and also, as we know from anyone who's ever experienced bullying, which is like everybody in their life, nobody wants to be in the one person in the corner everyone's pointing at. So everyone decides to stay in the group by going, oh my God, thank God it's not me, because I actually did sleep with the devil last night. So like, so then when they're pointing at it, all the problems are one old lady, and you can see all the justification. Well, it's just one old lady. She's got no family. Like, this is fine. I always thought she was a bit weird and grumpy anyway.
And you really see this in terms of how different regions respond to it. So half of those people who are executed in German states.
Wow.
But even in different towns, it can vary. So there's a German town called Rothenburg ab der Tauer where they had very, very few executions. And that's because they insisted rigorously on evidence being produced. And they would even torture those who were accusing to check that they were telling the truth.
Well,
so,
you're going to stop accusing so quickly, aren't you?
Or you
Not so many
really
people
have to believe in it, don't you?
You have to believe in it.
That's excellent German logic there, isn't it?
That's quite
okay,
similar
how serious are you about her accusation?
That's similar to, in ancient Greece, there was a city-state called Locris, where anyone was allowed to suggest a law, but if your law wasn't passed by the voters, you were hanged. So you had to really think you had the numbers. You had to really think it's a good idea for a law. Who's the last witch executed in Europe?
Our last official witch is a woman called Anna Goldie, who was executed in Glasgow in Switzerland in 1782.
Anna Goldie.
Yes.
That's quite a nice name.
And she was pardoned by the Swiss Parliament in 2007. They'd said
Oh,
it's a
really?
miscarriage of justice.
That's not very helpful, really.
It's a bit late, but we'll take it. We'll take it.
That's interesting.
But, I mean, when it stops varies greatly. I mean, the Dutch Republic, they stop in 1609.
Oh, lovely. The very sensible Dutch. Come on, guys, let's stop there.
And that's well before Matthew Hopkins, well before Salem. So it really varies.
Yeah.
And then legislation, interestingly, peters out or is repealed after people stop believing. So it's not actually that the law is repealed and then the trials stop. It's that the trials stop and then the law changes to reflect that.
Wow.
Oh, so the law basically follows on from the fact that people have stopped really accusing people of witchcraft.
Yes. So there's.
We should, that law about the witches. It's a bit embarrassing, isn't it? Actually, nobody believes in it anymore. Imagine that. It's like having a law against fairies or something, or like it's just.
Maybe we should have a law against fairies, just in case.
The Nuance Window!
This is where we allow our expert, Professor Susanna, to launch into a little lecture, just for a couple of minutes, on the thing that you think we need to hear, what's really important that we can hear. So I'm going to get my stopwatch up, and if you're ready, Susanna, here we go.
We know that most witches were poor elderly women, but the question is why? And there are two reasons. One is that it took time to build up a reputation as a witch. So at the trial, people would come up with, she did this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So years had to pass of you doing accumulated events that looked like witchcraft for you to be accused, which tells us that people were thinking more about witches than they actually accused people. So there were lots of people they thought were witches, potentially, but not ready to incriminate them yet. And that makes sense, because the last thing you'd want to do if you thought that someone was a witch was actually to annoy her. But the other thing about it is that it plays into an idea of the culture of motherhood at the time. So Professor Lyndall Roper has argued that the aesthetic of the period was affected by the fact that women were pretty much pregnant every other year once they got married. So you see those sort of pictures by Rubens, and you've got these big fleshy women with their huge hips and big bellies and heavy breasts. And women look like that because they looked like that, right? So this is what women look like. But witches are never depicted as that. Witches are depicted as being sagging and shriveled up, crones. So the crucial thing about them is not that they're old, it's that they're no longer fertile. And so that they are motivated to copulate with the devil because they're no longer having sex, probably widowed. They're motivated to attack children and young mothers. And so they are, the symbol of inversion. They are the anti-mother. And so what it comes down to is that we're not just looking at old women, we're looking at menopausal and post-menopausal women who no longer have the power that society gives them, and so therefore they're no longer fertile, and therefore they must be copulating with the devil and attacking those who have something they don't have. And I just think that idea is fascinating.
Applause from Carrier.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Oh, that's just classic, isn't it? Patriarchal society. What use is she now? I think that even our society today doesn't deal with menopausal women in a healthy way at all. It is terrible how menopausal women are treated. It's not discussed. And, there's a lot of talk now about periods and menstruation. Everyone's becoming very vocal about it, being like, hey, don't be ashamed. But even the menopause, you can see everyone being like, I still don't feel like I know anything about it. I still don't feel like I understand it in a way. And it's still very hushed, and women are still made to feel ashamed of it. And I think hopefully this generation of women who are now talking about periods all the time, myself included, when we hit that menopause, we will be able to hopefully be like, no, this needs to be talked about more, because I still think it's really hard. I still think it's treated like you're basically shriveled up. And do you know, though, that when you hit the menopause, your ovaries actually shrink? They physically shrivel.
But that's absolutely fine.
I know, but isn't it interesting that that's become a word that we associate?
Yeah,
so,
shrivel is not a good word, is it?
Something that's physically happening to women is then associated with, like, oh, that woman is shriveled and shrunk, and that's associated as negative. So it's interesting, those people in the 17th century wouldn't have known that ovaries literally physically decrease in size.
And it's that comparison with the fact that if we think of maybe some of these women were cunning women who had accumulated knowledge, who are therefore powerful in their minds, what better way to make them be belittled than by saying they're actually useless in their bodies, and therefore they've turned to the dark side.
Therefore they're evil, rather than they just don't need men anymore at all. I've worked out the herbs. My husband's dead. I don't need you around. Witch.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
We have more or less reached the end of the podcast, which means it's time to quiz our comedian, see what she has learned.
So what do you know now?
This is the bit which we call the So What Do You Know Now, because we had the So What Do You Know at the beginning. Now
Okay.
you've had a podcast
Yeah,
to teach us
I'm
stuff.
absolutely fascinated.
Let's see what has stuck in your brain.
Okay, please bear in mind, I also have recently had sleep deprivation torture, so my short-term memory is not as good as it was.
All right.
Okay.
Well, on
just
this show, I
caveating.
think the average score is about 7 out of 10.
Oh, yeah.
So, we're
Okay.
looking for you to
Okay,
get...
come on.
Come on, 2 out of 3
Just
you
like
can do.
pour the pressure on.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, okay.
You
So
can do
I'm
it.
starting
I
a
know
little
you can do it.
stopwatch here. 10 questions.
Oh, God.
Just
It's
yell
a
out
stopwatch.
what
Why
it-
is there a stopwatch? This is getting more like GCSEs. I'm panicking.
For my purposes, not
Okay,
yours. Don't
all right,
worry.
okay.
It's okay. All right, here we go. What was the Diabolic's Pact?
When a witch had made a pact with the devil
Yes.
to give away her soul.
Second question. Who was Anna Goldie?
Anna Goldie was the last witch killed
Yes.
in Switzerland.
Very good.
Quite late 1792.
Very close. Bang on, Marinus. Matthew Hopkins gave himself which title?
Witchfinder General.
Absolutely.
And he gave it to him himself.
What a dick. Which king wrote his book
James
Demonology?
I of England, James VI of Scotland.
Very accurate. In which country were over 90% of people accused of witchcraft men?
Iceland.
Iceland. What happened at the Samlesbury witch trials?
The Samlesbury was the one that the trial fell apart.
Yes.
After the Pendle Hill trials.
Very good.
And it was the girl was being coached by a naughty Catholic priest.
Bang on. In 1612, what was the name of the famous trial where lots of people were accused?
Pendle Hill.
Pendle Hill,
Yeah.
exactly. What was swimming?
Oh God, swimming. Oh, it wasn't dunking. Oh, it was where your thumbs were crossed and tied to your toes, and you were thrown into a river. And if you were evil, the river would eject you
Yes.
like a baptism.
You're doing really well. 9. What was the Malleus Maleficarum?
Malleus Maleficarum, Malleus Maleficarum. I liked the name so much. Hang on a minute. Was the book written by this Irish monk? German monk. I was getting my Irish confused. And it was about how to find witches, and he was the first a big bestseller.
It
Sold
was.
more than the Bible. Sold the same as the Bible.
Nearly as many as the
Nearly
Bible.
as many as the Bible.
And question 10. How many people were executed during the European witch craze in total, we think?
90,000.
10 out of 10?
Yay!
I mean, sleep deprivation works.
Yes. I really like witches.
See, that logic
yeah,
got us
yeah.
into trouble.
Yeah, sorry,
yeah.
I take that back. Okay. If the CIA are listening, please don't do it.
Yeah.
You've done really well there, Carrie.
Oh, it was
which
fascinating.
Obviously
So
means that
interesting.
Susanna is obviously an excellent teacher.
Yeah.
That's what we can take from this. Thank you so much. It's a really interesting subject.
It's
and it's
really
the kind of
interesting.
thing that actually we all know, and yeah, actually quite quickly you realise, hang on a minute, I don't really know this story at all.
Yeah.
So it's been fantastic having you both here. Thank you so much to both of you. Well, that's pretty much all we have time for. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please do share it with your friends, leave a review online, like and subscribe, do all those button things that you're meant to do with podcasts. It's called You're Dead to Me. Big thank you to my guests, Professor Susanna Lipscomb and Carrie Ad Lloyd. Thank you both for coming in. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank
yeah.
you. Yeah.
Malleus Maleficarum.
We're singing that all day, aren't
Yep.
we? Join me next time. We'll be venturing to another dark corner of the past with 2 completely different travel companions. I'm off to go and watch reruns of Charmed. See ya! You're Dead to Me was a Muddy Knees media production for BBC Radio 4. The researchers were Evie Randall and Esther Jarbo, and the script was by Emma Nagoose. The producer was Dan Murray.
Russell Kane here, and I'm here to tell you about Evil Genius, the BBC Radio 4 podcast, where we take icons from history and then decimate them by slinging mud. Think you know everything about Einstein? You don't. He was a woman hater. You probably think you know about Amy Winehouse, that she was a victim. She had a pretty dark side, and we're not shy about exploring it. Evil Genius. We take people from history, and a panel of 3 fellow jesters have to vote at the end of the show. No ifs, no buts, no grey areas. Evil or genius. Plus hilarious banter as well. So head to BBC Sounds now and hit subscribe.